lecture cycle, let me also add some words to this cordial, theosophically heartfelt welcome. This is necessary because in the days and months to come, friends here will perhaps often have the opportunity to say a word or two concerning the true state of affairs of the events that recently occurred among us. From the various responses and statements that have appeared, one may gather that here or there it was considered unnatural that as far as our meetings, our internal meetings are concerned, we chose the method of not allowing members of the Theosophical Society, to the extent that it is controlled by Adyar, into these internal meetings, Adyar being a place in India. It is clear that people have not universally accepted this needed measure as necessary, that in many places people thought that we would have done better to maintain the peace, or what is the same thing, not to have held so firmly to this measure. And yet, dear friends, if you truly consider all that has happened, you will, each of you, be able to agree, indeed you will have to agree, that in so grave an instance, this measure had to be taken. Indeed, you need consider only that the German section did not just, to express it technically, leave the Theosophical Society, but that it was in all reality expelled, again for a reason that can be technically, although very peculiarly defined, in that some people even go so far as to dare say that the German section violated some statute of the Theosophical Society. Indeed, it is said that the German section excluded members of the Star of the East, that is, adherents of a certain opinion, from its membership. Footnote, the Star of the East was the name given to the order formed to promote the young Krishnamurti as the reincarnated Christ. End of footnote. Here, we must consider everything that happened previously on the other side. That is, the German section really had no choice but to exclude certain individuals from the meetings of the German section. Not the members of the Star of the East as such, but certain individuals who had to be considered in Germany as members of the Star of the East. From the moment that the Star of the East entered Germany, it took a position that was clearly and intentionally hostile to the German section. That is, it tried hard to follow the policy, which among other things was reported in a, one could say, strange, underhanded way in the March issue of title The Theosophist. In other words, those who had taken up the banner of the Star of the East tried to present our work before the world as if we had descended to excluding from our endeavors any spiritual opinion or point of view. That was a cardinal accusation brought against the German section. And it was based completely on something that was objectively untrue. All measures of a more moderate nature were useless against such subversive activity that continually sought to blacken the entire character of our movement in the eyes of the whole world. As a result, we were forced, for the sake of our work, to conclude that we could not work with those in Germany who had joined the Star of the East. Similar attacks came also from individuals associated with the Star of the East in other countries. The steps then taken against the Star of the East were no more than a defensive measure, and whoever presents it otherwise is not telling the truth. They were a necessary defense, demanded because our work was not merely disturbed, but would have become simply impossible if we had not taken such a measure. It is characteristic of our work that people pointed out the existence of lodges among us that worked very differently than we did, and that not a hair of their heads was touched. We gave charters to lodges that stood for viewpoints very different from ours. But if lodges sought to be established with the expressed view of the Star of the East's subversive activity, whose very name already indicated attacks against us, not only against our work, but against the truthfulness and honesty of our theosophical approach, then a defensive measure was needed, because had we created such lodges, we would by that token be insincere and unfaithful. And so we were faced with the necessity either of becoming deeply and inwardly untrue, or of taking these defensive measures against the members of the Star of the East. Tactics can always be presented in a special light if one first compels someone to an action and then characterizes this action as unlawful. It must be said that one actually rarely finds people taking such measures in the world. One rarely finds that people behave in such a way. It remains reserved for the present Theosophical Society to act in this way to so high a degree. Moreover, if you read the letter directed through Mrs. Besant to the General Secretary of what was then the section, telling of the forthcoming exclusion of the German section, you will be able to consider this letter as anything other than a real expulsion. You will have to say that had the German section not viewed it in this way, it would have placed itself on a false footing. Then, too, you must also consider that these things were preceded by a circular letter on my part to the General Secretary, in which I exhaustively laid out the situation. This circular letter contains the real source for judging the facts. It is distressing to experience that with the exception of the General Secretary of the Scandinavian section, who has meanwhile resigned, not a single person among the General Secretaries and in the General Council was in any way prepared to speak up to agree to what I had presented. Everything that came from the General Secretary's side was worded in such a way that it was assumed from the start that all the versions from the Theosophical headquarters in Adyar were the only authoritative ones that could serve as a basis for judging the situation. This is one troubling fact that followed as a result of my circular letter of that time. You could say that when one witnesses this general deafness of the whole corporate theosophical body with regard to these most explicit facts, one would be justified in feeling overcome by pain at the fate of the Theosophical Society. The crown was then placed onto the whole system by Mrs. Besant's speech to the convention meeting of representatives in Adyar, in which she demonstrated that she lacked any possibility of finding a relationship to the feeling of duty one must have, first to test the facts, and then to make a statement. Mrs. Besant, as everyone now knows, asserted there that I was educated by Jesuits. I cannot, in all truth, say what a slap in the face, in an absurd, foolish way, this assertion was, hurled at us during that same gathering by the head of the leadership of the Theosophical Society, just when, with many friends, including some from here, we gave our lecture cycle in Cologne, footnote titled The Bhagavad Gita and the Epistles of St. Paul, end of footnote. That cycle confirmed, just recently, how strongly and truthfully we sought to stand on the good soil of the old Theosophical Society. You must feel, dear Theosophical friends, the whole anomaly of such a fact. Not only that this happened, but that Mrs. Besant had the audacity, the unenviable audacity, to fabricate an answer to the facts I presented in the newsletter of the Mitteilungen, in which I was first compelled to describe those facts, at the end of which she wrote that these would be her last words on this matter. Dear Theosophical friends, after the experiences we have had up to now, there might perhaps still be, it might conceivably be the case that there still are, people in the Theosophical Society who still give some credence to this answer. In this answer, you could look for one word that corresponds to the objective truth and not find it, because in this answer everything is turned on its head, so that precisely this turning on its head is done with an almost monstrous verbal attack. It borders on the miraculous that there can be anyone capable of turning things on their head in such a way. Every sentence contains something that is just the opposite of what happened. At the General Assembly in Berlin, that is the meeting of the Anthroposophical Society, I did not refer to this document with a single word, in order not to take up any more time than already had been. Footnote, this was the meeting of February 3rd, 1913, the keynote address of which is contained in the prologue to this volume. End of footnote. I will not get into this document today, a document that anyone had only to read to see the spirit in which it was conceived. I will go into only one point because one cannot really see it immediately from the document. Toward the end, you will find a sentence that goes something like this, quote, Dr. Steiner says that the pamphlet by Dr. Vollrath, this refers to the printed pamphlet spoken of in such an intolerable way in the preceding General Assembly, merely repeated certain statements regarding Vollrath's expulsion directed at me by Mrs. Besant, close quote. Anyone who can read will see that she says that this documentation by Dr. Vollrath's appeal exists, but she says more. She says, quote, if that pamphlet contains no more than the document directed to me by Dr. Vollrath, then it must be very harmless, close quote. Her assertion that the pamphlet must be harmless, however, itself repeats the assertions contained in Dr. Vollrath's appeal to Mrs. Besant, which she, of course, claimed were harmless in the first place. Now, among these charges there is, for example, the point that Dr. Vollrath sought to assert against me because, according to him, I enjoyed too high an income too greedily, and because my exercises were so markedly, in quotes, black magic, that countless people had become ill, and that some had even died, and that all those exercises were again only to gain magical powers rather than knowledge, and so on, and so forth. Of all these things, Dr. Vollrath affirmed that he was willing to provide evidence to Mrs. Besant if she wanted it. This was the document that Vollrath sent to Adyar. Footnote, Hugo Vollrath of Leipzig, a theosophical book dealer and publisher, was long a thorn in Steiner's side. Vollrath was excluded from the German section in 1908, but not from the society. Annie Besant was informed of this by Rudolf Steiner. In 1911, Vollrath demanded his reinstatement and published a libel against Rudolf Steiner. Simultaneously, he was elected, alongside Hubert Schleiden, to represent the Order of the Star of the East in Germany. See title From the History and Contents of the Esoteric Section, which has recently been published. End of footnote. This letter lay before Mrs. Besant, and what I have mentioned was the part that pulled it all together. Mrs. Besant said of it, quote, if Dr. Steiner maintains that this pamphlet contains only repetitions of that appeal, then this pamphlet must be of a very harmless nature, close quote. Thus, Mrs. Besant claims to the world that, quote, Dr. Steiner wished to feather his own nest, parenthesis, whereas I actually declined an income, close quote, and gave exercises that were of the nature of black magic and made people ill, indeed from which people even died, close quote. These accusations were in fact made at that time, and Mrs. Besant, in order to present the matter to the world in her terms, called them harmless. This is how what Mrs. Besant dished up recently for her followers was cooked up. I do not want to add anything else to these things. They become more and more unbearable the more one adds to them. I would ask only whether the feelings we had at that time in Berlin, when our friends resolved to work so that the line could now finally be drawn, that is, whether we were justified in our feelings in assuming as self-evident, that our friends of their own accord would consider it impossible to speak to those who would later call themselves followers of Mrs. Besant. It would be a violation of all occult principles if we wished to speak to those who had, I must use the expression, thrown someone out, who had presented someone in such a light as Mrs. Besant had chosen to do. To go into things such as the March issue of titled The Theosophist is so repugnant to me that I will not do it. For there, dipped in a sugary sweet coating, is the most underhanded attack you could possibly conceive of. In principle, you have seen this from the statutes of the Anthroposophical Society. We stand by the position that anyone can come to us. Those, however, who are incapable of looking into the truth regarding the affair we are dealing with, even when they claim they want to join us, declare that as a matter of principle, they actually want us out of their corporate body. And behavior of the General Secretaries proves that we would be untruthful if we now took measures other than drawing the line between what we wanted and what was done not according to the principles, but against all principles of the old Theosophical Society, which is now within this Theosophical Society. I must also say something, however, dear Theosophical friends, about the other side of this whole affair. In fact, what I have said so far was necessary so that our friends would not be, as it were, put into the embarrassing situation of not knowing how to respond when this or that was spoken of. This is the only reason I had to say what I did, as a background to what I must now say to you as a kind of greeting. In truth, dear Theosophical friends, I must confess that I myself, if I may speak to you for a moment, and the friendship you have shown me in a certain way, justifies me in this. I feel that everything that has happened is, aside from all the bitterness and sorrow, also a great liberation, a liberation from precisely the narrowness that has weighed us down in the life of the Theosophical Society for years, beginning with that Munich Congress of the European sections, where the attempt was then made to bring a timid but salient new note into the Theosophical Society, not on any nationalistic and one-sided basis of opinion, but on a truly broad contemporary foundation. Footnote: the Congress of the Federation of European Sections of the Theosophical Society took place in May of 1907. Whereas previously the Congresses had a more scientific character, Rudolf Steiner now sought to introduce an artistic impulse. End of footnote. When we did this, you could hear the judgment. What you have done is not theosophy, but something very different. A society based on occultism still contains, even when, in a certain sense, the individual may become free of its limits and boundaries, the forces that work spiritually or psychically. Yet it was simply impossible to raise what we may justifiably call occultism in all its broad-heartedness and adaptation to our present human cycle, to its true value within the framework of the Theosophical Society. It is my hope, therefore, that if it is granted us to lead the Anthroposophical Society further, our friends will be convinced that the liberation from the Theosophical Society will bring not a narrowing, but rather a broadening of our occult striving. In the Anthroposophical Society, it will truly be possible to realize all kinds of things that were impossible to realize within the Theosophical Society because of preconceptions that confront a person with narrowly defined traditions. Those who have the desire will be able to see that. From now on, we must seek precisely the breadth of perspective needed in our present time. We must do this so that the part of humanity that understands will be able to benefit from what truly flows from the spiritual worlds into our time, into spiritual wisdom and spiritual will impulses. It therefore seems to me that this first lecture cycle celebrated here, the first lecture cycle of the newly founded Anthroposophical Society, is one most especially to be welcomed. The end of the introductory words. This is a reading of a cycle of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled The Effects of Esoteric Development. This is lecture 1, which is the third item in this list. There was first a prologue, a lecture given in Berlin in 1913 at the, in a sense, founding of the Anthroposophical Society. Then the opening words before this cycle of lectures given in The Hague. And this lecture 1 is entitled The Influences of Esoteric Life on the Human Sheaths, given March 20th, 1913. I propose to speak to you, my dear friends, on a topic that may be important for many of you at the present time. It is important mostly for all of you who are striving in some way to make spiritual science more than a mere theory. In other words, for those who take spiritual science into their hearts and souls, so that it becomes an effective part and the real substance of their lives, permeating their whole existence as human beings today. What I have to say is important, not only for the actual esotericist, but for all those who wish to permeate their soul forces with anthroposophical thoughts, to learn something of the changes that the human being as a whole experiences through practicing the exercises given in my book titled How to Know Higher Worlds, or sketched more briefly in the second part of titled An Outline of Esoteric Science. Important even to those who merely wish wholeheartedly to adopt anthroposophical concepts. Anthroposophy, when cultivated seriously, whether esoterically or exoterically, produces certain changes in the whole human organism. Through the practice and experience of anthroposophy, we may say with confidence that one becomes a different person. That is, the whole human structure is transformed. The physical body, the etheric body, the astral body, and the true capital I of the human being are changed when one genuinely and inwardly assimilates anthroposophy. In what follows, then, I propose to discuss the modifications to the human sheaths that occur under the influences of esoteric practice and the exoteric study of anthroposophy when done seriously. It is especially difficult to speak about modifications of the physical body, because although in the beginning of esoteric life such changes are important and meaningful, they are also difficult to describe accurately. Important, significant changes occur in the physical body, but they are imperceptible externally to any outer means for acquiring knowledge. Such changes are imperceptible because the physical body is that aspect of the human being, from the most inward to the most outward, least under a person's control, and also because dangers would arise immediately if esoteric exercises or anthroposophical activity were directed so that the modifications in the physical body exceeded what one was capable of mastering fully. Thus, the modifications of the physical body are kept within certain limits. It is important, nevertheless, that a person know something about and clearly understand these modifications. If we wish to summarize the modifications that the physical body experiences under the conditions just mentioned, we can say that the physical body initially becomes more mobile and more inwardly active. What do we mean by, quote, more mobile, close quote? In ordinary human life, the physical body's individual organs communicate with one another and are interconnected in a particular way. The effects generated by the individual organs penetrate one another. But when someone is serious in taking up esotericism or anthroposophy, one's individual organs become more autonomous or less interdependent. The life of the physical body as a whole becomes more subdued, damped down, or muted, and life is reinforced for the organs individually. The reduction of the body's life as a whole, as well as the reinforcement of life in the individual organs, is extremely small. Nevertheless, through the influence of esotericism and anthroposophy, all the organs, especially the heart, brain, and spinal cord, become more autonomous, more active, and more independent of one another. They become inwardly more mobile, moving from a state of static equilibrium to a state of more variable equilibrium. It is good to be aware of this fact, because when something of this variable equilibrium is perceived, one tends to attribute it to ill health. We are not accustomed to experiencing such mobility and independence of our organs, and feel or experience our bodily organs only when they do not function normally. When we experience autonomy of our organs, which may occur in a very mild way, we may think that it is due to illness, and thus, you see, we must be careful when dealing with the physical body. Clearly, what may be in one case the onset of illness may be in another case simply an attendant phenomenon or symptom of the inner life of anthroposophy. Each case must thus be assessed individually. What one accomplishes in this way through the practice of anthroposophy is very much in accordance with the normal course of humanity's development. In earlier epochs of human evolution, individual organs were more interdependent in outer life than they are today, but in future they will become more autonomous. Just as one who follows anthroposophy must anticipate stages of development within the various spheres of life and presage knowledge that all of humanity will attain only in the future, so also one must accept that in keeping with this stage of development, a person's physical organs will become independent. This modification can manifest almost imperceptibly in the individual organs and organic systems. Allow me to present a specific example. We are all familiar with this phenomenon. When we settle somewhere and our work provides little opportunity to travel, we become, in quotes, rooted in there. Out in the country, we find that the farmers are much more connected to their native soil and climate than the city dwellers, who often want to spend their holidays in the countryside. If transplanted to another region or climate, peasants may find it difficult to acclimate to new surroundings and may experience in the depths of their souls an undeniable longing for their native soil. This is merely a reminder that one must adapt the whole organism when entering a new region and new climate. Ordinarily, such adaptation in fact occurs within the context of the whole organism. When we leave the plains for the mountains, or if we move to a distant country, everything is affected. For the esotericist or serious student of anthroposophy, the organism as a whole is no longer involved, but rather the blood system dissociates itself. At the same time, the circulation of the blood, which is affected to a greater degree when a person moves from one geographic area to another, separates from the rest of the organism. Those who develop a particular sensitivity to these things indeed can detect a change in the pulsation of the blood, a change in the way the pulse beats when traveling from one place to another. However, whereas the necessary adjustment makes heavy demands on the nervous system of an ordinary person, in the case of the esotericist and serious student of anthroposophy, the nervous system will be little affected. Indeed, for the esotericist, the nervous system retreats because, due to the anthroposophical inner life, the nerve and blood systems separate. The blood system becomes more sensitive to the influences of climate and soil, while the nervous system becomes more independent. If you want to find evidence of this, you must look where it may be found most easily. That is, whenever you find yourself in a similar position when you yourself move to a new area. Pay attention, observe yourself carefully, and you will confirm this occult fact. It is extremely important to keep such an occult fact in mind, because it is gradually transformed into a very definite faculty of perception. All those who inwardly in their hearts become anthroposophists notice the character of a foreign town through the circulation of their blood. There is no need for further investigation. We can tell by the pulsation of the blood how the various regions of the earth differ from one another. The nervous system, on the other hand, dissociates itself from the whole organism in a different way. Those who are permeated with anthroposophy, as I have indicated, increasingly notice that their awareness of the differences among the four seasons, especially between summer and winter, is very different than that of ordinary human beings today. Human beings, for the most part, ordinarily feel only the physical differences of temperature, but those who have filled their souls with anthroposophy perceive not only the differences in temperature, they also have a particular experience within the nervous system. They find it easier, for example, to cultivate thoughts related particularly to the physical brain in summer rather than in winter. Not that it is impossible to think certain thoughts in winter, but one can see quite clearly that it is easier to do so in summer than in winter, that they flow more easily in summer. We can observe that in the winter, thoughts tend to become abstract, whereas in summer, they are more likely to be pictorial and substantial. This is because the nervous system, the instrument intended for the physical plane, responds in delicate harmony with the change of seasons, and is affected in a way that is more independent of the whole organism than is usual. A fundamental change occurs, however, in the physical body. We begin to be more aware of our physical body than ever before, and this may assume the most disturbing forms. The physical body becomes more responsive and sensitive to the soul's life, whereas the soul finds it more difficult to bear its relationship to the body. It is extremely difficult to explain this clearly. Imagine a glass of water in which salt has been dissolved, producing a cloudy liquid. Assume that as the human being's normal state, the etheric body, the astral body, and the I are represented as the liquid, and that the physical body is like the salt dissolved in the liquid. When the liquid is allowed to cool, the salt will slowly crystallize and become heavier, having become, in quotes, independent of the liquid. Likewise, the physical body, in quotes, crystallizes out of the whole structure of the four members of the human being. It contracts, even though this occurs only to a small degree. This must be taken quite literally. It, in quotes, shrivels in a certain sense. But you must not imagine this so dramatically that you become afraid of becoming excessively wrinkled through anthroposophical development. The shriveling is a process of densification within the body itself. As a result of this densification, the physical body demonstrates that it has now become more difficult for it to integrate with the human being's other members. On the one hand, there is an experience of the physical body as less mobile. On the other hand, the body's other members are more mobile. Before, if it was healthy, we did not experience the physical body as such, and referred to it very comfortably as, in quotes, capital I. Afterward, we experience the body as heavier than before. We experience it as something finite within, and distinct from our being as a whole. We especially begin to gain awareness of all of those organs in the physical body that lead an independent existence. Here we touch upon a question, the question of meat as food for human beings, which can be fully understood only in this context. I have no wish, of course, to aggravate a controversial issue. I only wish to present the facts. We are concerned here with the human physical body. First, however, we must describe the nature of animal food, plant food, and food in general. All this is intended as one aspect of the discussion of the influences of anthroposophical life on the human sheaths. We may describe this aspect as the restoration or regeneration of the physical body through ingesting the substances we receive from without. Our relationship as human beings to food is understood properly only when we are mindful of the relationship between the human being and the other kingdoms of nature. The plant kingdom, as one of the realms of life, brings in organic substances or mineral substances to a certain level of organization. In regard to the living plant's development, we assume that lifeless substances are transformed and raised to a certain level of organization, as though the plant were a living laboratory. In the plant, we have a living organism that brings the lifeless products of nature to a certain stage of development. As human beings, we are constituted in such a way, physically, that we are in a position to continue this process of development from the point where the plant left off. Thus, the higher human organism arises when we develop further what the plant has already brought to a certain level. Things are designed with such economy that when we pluck an apple and eat it, we are aware of the perfect continuity. That is the most perfect example of continuity. If things were designed so that they followed the most natural course, we might say that the most natural course would be for us to continue the process of development from the point where the plant left off. That is, for us to take the organs of the plant as we find them externally, and from that point to develop them further within ourselves. Such a course would provide a continuous line of development, uninterrupted anywhere or in any way. This development would reach a certain stage, moving first from lifeless substance up to the plant and then to another level as it continued from there to the human organism. Let us now take the simple example of a person who enjoys eating meat. The animal is a living being that takes the process of organization farther than the plant, to a stage beyond what is achieved by the plant organization. Thus we can say that the animal continues and furthers the process of organization achieved by the plant. Now, let's look at someone who eats animal flesh. What happens is that the human being no longer needs to use the inner forces that would be necessary to digest plant food. With plant food, we must utilize certain forces to organize the food material from the point where the plant left off. These forces remain unused when we eat animal flesh, because the animal has already brought the plant's organism to a higher stage, and the human being merely needs to begin at the point already reached by the animal. Thus, in the case of animal food, we can say that the human being does not continue the work of organization from the point reached by the plant, but that forces within such a person remain unused by entering the process of organization at a later stage of development. The meat eater allows the animal to assume a part of the work that would have been performed by a person who had eaten plant food instead. As organisms, our well-being does not depend on working as little as possible, but on activating all our forces. When we eat only plant food, we stimulate the forces that develop organic activities. But when we eat animal food, we fail to use these forces and act like someone who says, quote, "I will do without my left arm. I will tie it up so that it cannot be used," close quote. By eating animal flesh, we imprison inner forces that would otherwise be called on when eating plant food. We condemn to inactivity a certain amount of forces within the human organism. Consequently, the organizations involved, which would otherwise be active, lie fallow, become crippled and hardened. When we eat animal flesh, therefore, we kill, or at least paralyze, part of our organism. And we carry this part of the organism, which is thus hardened within us, throughout our lives, as if it were a foreign body. Ordinarily, a person is unaware of this foreign body. However, when the physical organism becomes more mobile inwardly, and the organs become more independent of one another, as occurs in esoteric training, the physical body, which already feels ill at ease, begins to feel even more uneasy, because it now has within it a foreign body. As I have said, I am not trying to create controversy, but only want to speak the truth. We shall learn about other effects of animal food, but it is enough for now to discuss this aspect in detail. Progress in anthroposophical life thus gradually produces a kind of disgust for animal food. Not that it is necessary to forbid animal food to anthroposophists. Through the development of a healthy instinctive life, one gradually comes to reject animal food as one loses the taste for it. This is much better than becoming a vegetarian because of some abstract principle. It is best, however, when anthroposophy naturally develops a kind of disgust and abhorrence of animal food. To abstain from animal food for other reasons is of little value in terms of what may be termed a human being's higher development. We can say then that animal food produces something that in human beings the physical body experiences as a burden. These are the facts in the matter from an occult perspective. Let us now examine this question from a different viewpoint. I would like to consider the example of alcohol. Our relationship to alcohol is also modified when we make anthroposophy an integral part of life. Alcohol is something very peculiar in the kingdom of nature, and it turns out to be not only dead weight in the human organism, but in fact acts directly as a counter force on it. When we observe a plant, we find that it develops its organization up to a certain point. The grapevine is an exception in this regard. It develops beyond this point. Everything that other plants reserve solely for the seed, the vegetative power, that is, all of the vegetal germinating power usually reserved for the seed, which does not enter into the rest of the plant, in the grape flows into the fruit as well. Thus, through what is known as fermentation, the transformation of what in the grape itself has been activated to the maximum, something is produced in the plant that has a power that, in an occult sense, can be compared only to the power of the human eye over the blood. In the making of wine and the production of alcohol, therefore, what the human being must create when the eye affects the blood is created in another kingdom of nature. We know that there is a close relationship between the eye and the blood. This is expressed externally when the eye experiences shame and a blush suffuses the human countenance, or when the eye experiences fear or anxiety and the person turns pale. This effect of the eye on the blood, which is a normal process, is similar to the effect produced when the vegetal process becomes reversed through the process of transforming the fruit of the grape, indeed whatever arises from the very nature of a plant, into alcohol. The eye creates a process in the blood, as a matter of course. And here I am speaking from occult's insight, not from chemistry. That is very similar to the process produced in the grape by reversing the process of organization through the purely chemical action of making alcohol. Consequently, alcohol introduces into the organism something that acts just as the eye acts on the blood, but from outside. In other words, when we consume alcohol, we introduce an anti-eye into our being, an eye that directly opposes the actions of our spiritual eye. We may say that compared to how the eye acts on the blood, alcohol acts on it from the opposite side. Thus, an inner war is unleashed. And when we place the antagonist inherent in alcohol in opposition to the eye, we condemn to impotence everything that proceeds from the eye. This is the situation from the occult viewpoint. A person who abstains from alcohol ensures the possibility that the eye can work freely on the blood. An individual who drinks alcohol behaves like someone wishing to demolish a wall, hammers on one side, while at the same time placing on the other side people who hammer in opposition. Consuming alcohol eliminates the eye's activity on the blood in exactly the same way. Those who make anthroposophy the cornerstone of their lives, therefore, experience the action of alcohol in the blood as a direct attack upon the eye. It is thus very natural that true spiritual development progresses only when one avoids this conflict. From this example, we see how equilibrium, normally present in the physical body, experiences a transformation in the anthroposophist, and how that altered equilibrium also becomes perceptible. There are many other ways that the individual organs and organic systems of the physical organization become more independent. The spinal cord and the brain especially become much more independent of each other. Tomorrow we shall speak more on the subject of nutrition and on the occult physiology of nutrition. Today, however, I want to stay with the theme of the organ's independence. The independence of the spinal cord from the brain arises because when a person's soul is permeated with anthroposophy, such a person gradually begins to have an experience in the context of the physical body, as if this aspect, the spinal cord, were actually achieving greater independence. This in turn may lead to very unpleasant situations. It is all the more necessary, therefore, that we should be aware of this. It may happen that, for example, even though one normally has self-control, more advanced students may suddenly notice that they are speaking words very unintentionally. Such a person may walk along a road and suddenly notice that a word has slipped out, perhaps a favorite expression, that wouldn't have been expressed except for this dissociation of the spinal cord from the brain. Something that otherwise would have been restrained becomes a reflex action because of this dissociation of the spinal cord from the brain. In the brain, meanwhile, certain parts become independent of other parts. Whereas in normal life, the inner and outer parts of the brain work in harmony, the inner parts of the brain, for example, now become more independent of the outer parts surrounding them. This is demonstrated when, for the esotericist or the true anthroposophist, abstract thinking becomes more difficult than it was before, and gradually meets with resistance from the brain. The budding anthroposophist finds it easier to think imaginatively than to think abstractly. This is something that becomes noticeable in some especially ardent anthroposophists. They show a disposition only for anthroposophical activity. They like to read anthroposophical literature, to reflect on anthroposophical subjects, not just because they are ardent anthroposophists, but because they find it easier to penetrate these more spiritual ideas or views, which, insofar as the physical plane is concerned, call on the central parts of the brain, whereas abstract thinking uses the outer parts. This is why some overzealous anthroposophists have an aversion to abstract thinking and abstract knowledge. And this again is why some anthroposophists note with a certain regret that although previously they could easily think in abstract terms, they now find that just such abstract thinking becomes more difficult. Individual organs thus become relatively more active and independent, and even parts within these organs become more active and independent. You can see from this that something new must arise in individuals who go through this transformation. Previously, it was benevolent nature that, without our direct cooperation, brought our organs into the right harmonious relationship. Now, these organs become more independent. They are related more loosely to one another, and we must have the inner strength to reestablish harmony among them. This harmony of the various organs may be attained through a sound study of anthroposophy, because anthroposophy continually emphasizes whatever increases our ability to rule over those organs that have become independent. Remember, therefore, how often people have emphasized how terribly difficult anthroposophy is, and this plays a large part in our anthroposophical literature. When I learned that my book titled Theosophy was too difficult for beginners, I often had to give people the same answer. It should not have been any easier. If it had been easier, people would certainly accept some anthroposophical truths that have the effect of making the various parts of the brain independent. This book is therefore built on a logical structure of thought, so that the other part of the brain has to be continually active and brought into play, as it were. It is the special characteristic of movements such as ours, those with an occult foundation, not only to pay attention to what is right in the abstract sense, conveying it as one thinks best, but to communicate it in a healthy way and as truthfully as possible, to see that these matters are not given out in such a way just for the sake of making them popular, that they may do harm. In anthroposophy, it is not simply a question of imparting the appropriate truths in books and lectures. It is a question of how they are written and communicated. It is all the better if those who wish to be the vehicle of such a movement refuse to allow themselves to be deterred from giving out this or that for the sake of popularity. In anthroposophy, more than in any other domain, it is important to adhere to the plain, unvarnished truth. And when one touches on such questions as, quote, the transformation of the human sheaths through the practice of anthroposophy, close quote, one realizes immediately how necessary it is to present anthroposophy to the world in the right way. I would like to point out that the lectures I propose to give here must be taken as a whole, and that certain doubts that might arise in the minds of some of the audience on hearing this first lecture will be dispelled later. The end of Lecture 1. This is a reading of a cycle of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled The Effects of Esoteric Development. This is Lecture 2, entitled The Question of Food. given on March 21st, 1913. To the anthroposophist, the effects of esoteric or anthroposophical practice on the etheric and astral sheaths and on the eye are far more intimate than its effects on the physical body. Nevertheless, while we consider the more spiritual members of human nature in this regard, we shall lay a firm foundation for the next lectures if we remember what can be said about changes in the physical sheath. It should be emphasized, however, that the modifications indicated here do not refer to the highest stages of initiation, but only to the earlier stages of the esoteric or anthroposophical life. They are therefore of general importance. You will understand from yesterday's lecture that through the influences I described, the human physical body becomes more alive and more inwardly mobile, so to speak. Therefore, its presence may present a difficulty for the other members of the human being. We can feel its presence more than we would in an outer exoteric, so-called normal life. We shall speak later of the difference between vegetable and animal nutrition in relation to the other sheaths. The difference in nutrition, however, certainly plays an enormous part in the structure and organization of the physical body. I must emphasize, of course, that I have no wish to advocate any particular kind of diet. I only wish to state the facts in this matter. Indeed, as the soul develops, the facts in this matter become a direct personal experience. We know from experience that the physical body bears a heavier burden when we eat meat than when we live on a vegetarian diet. I pointed out yesterday that the physical body in the course of esoteric development contracts or shrivels, detaching itself from the higher spiritual members. Now, when sustenance for the human body is drawn from the animal realm, the body experiences it as a foreign substance introduced into the human organism, or to word it more radically, as a stake driven into the flesh. Thus, during esoteric development, we feel more of an earthbound heaviness from animal food than we would otherwise. And we become especially aware of how animal food matter stirs up the instinctive life of the will, the aspect of the will life that is largely unconscious and tends to work into the emotions and passions and becomes inflamed by animal products. The observation that warlike peoples are more inclined to eat meat than peace-loving ones is perfectly correct. But this should not lead us to believe that a vegetable diet necessarily deprives a human being of all courage and capacity to act. Indeed, we shall see that what a person loses in instincts, aggressive passions, and emotions by abstaining from animal foods is compensated for within the life of the soul. We will discuss this later when we speak about the astral body. This is connected with the whole relationship between humanity and the other kingdoms of nature and the cosmos. As we experience the processes of the physical body becoming more active and mobile, we recognize to a certain extent in our own bodies the nature and properties of the natural products of the earth that we use for food. Thus, we gradually receive a kind of proof or confirmation of what the occultist affirms about the relationship between human life and the cosmos, even when we have not yet achieved it through clairvoyance. It is interesting to compare three kinds of food in relation to their cosmic significance. First, there is milk and its products. Second, there are plants and the foods prepared from them. And finally, there is nourishment through the use of animal products. We can begin to compare milk, plant, and animal as nutrients when we have learned, through esoteric development, to distinguish their effects within the human organism. It is then easier to confirm the statements that arise from a rational observation of the material world. Occult observation of the cosmos reveals that milk substance can be found on Earth, but not on any other planet in our solar system. What is produced in a similar manner in the organism of living beings on other planets in our solar system would be something totally different from terrestrial milk. Milk is unique to the earthly realm. If we wanted to generalize about milk, we would have to say that the beings inhabiting each planetary system have their own particular milk. When we examine the plant system of Earth and compare it from an occult perspective with the plant systems of other planets, that is, with what corresponds to plant systems on other planets, we could say that the plant forms on Earth are different from those on other planets of our solar system. Yet the inner nature of the plants on Earth does not derive merely from earthly existence. The inner nature of plants belongs in the context of the solar system. That is, plant nature on Earth is connected to the nature of plants on other planets of our solar system. There is an element in our plants that can be found also on other planets in our solar system. As for the animal kingdom, it follows from what I said about milk that the animal kingdom on Earth, and this can easily be demonstrated from an occult perspective, is radically different from any corresponding kingdom on other planets. If we take the effect of milk as nutrient for the human body, nourishment from milk demonstrates to the occultist that milk is, so to speak, not just the element that binds the human body to Earth, but also the element that brings the body together with the human species on Earth as belonging to a common genus. That humankind, in relation to the physical system of sheaths, also constitutes a whole is because of the fact that milk, as a living nutrient, provides sustenance for living beings of animal provenance. Everything that milk supplies to the human organism prepares an individual to be a human creature on Earth, placed within earthly circumstances, and yet not actually confined to Earth. It makes the human being a citizen of the Earth, but does not prevent someone from being at the same time a citizen of the entire solar system. With regard to animal foods, the situation is different. Meat is derived from a domain that is specifically earthbound, but meat, unlike milk, is not obtained directly from the life processes of the living being, human or animal. Meat is obtained from the part of animal substance that has already been prepared for the animal. Such food binds the human being directly to the earth. It makes the human being into an earthbound creature. Therefore, we must say that